buenos días. En primer lugar.
Good morning. Thank you to the Carlos Damberes Foundation for inviting us and for organizing this meeting. The presidency of Latvia and Italy for being here. And we're going to talk about the economic future of the EU, which is the future of Europe, really. The Union began as a project, economic, basically commercial trade project, and has been developed like that. And the crisis, which started in the US but then took over in Europe and produced a chain effect that affected the economy, society, and everything. We have 2 sessions to talk about all this process. We're going to focus first on more economic issues within the Union. We're going to go to the macro level, to the specific level. We're going to go to from the design of how things are working in the monetary and fiscal aspects, to education, to employment, to innovation, how all this affects the situation. And then in a second session we're going to look and see how this is affecting the other economies. And we have here people who know very much about all this and are going to understand us. I have Xavier Vidal-Folch here, journalist from El País, Xavier Prats-Monné, who's General Director for Education and Culture at the European Commission, and former Manager for Employment, Director for Employment at the European Commission. We have Carlos Alvarez, who's the founder and president of the Innaxis Foundation, which focuses on technological innovation and sustainability. And we will have Guillermo de la Dehesa. I apologize, he's not yet arrived, but he will soon arrive and join us. We've asked the participants to please keep to their 10 minutes time so that we can then have a conversation and open up the floor. Xavier, hello, good morning. First of all, I've got to apologize because I'm not going to follow the script, catastrophic and irritating script, which seems to be the standard in our public debate, especially if it has to do with Europe. I think that the issue is, are we moving towards a Europe of greater cohesion or a Europe of inequality? In order to know the answer to that question, I would first like to say, or ask another question: what's the starting point? Now, this invention of the European Union is now almost 30 years old. And it would be a good idea to see why we have the problems we have. And the problems we have, I think, come from 4 areas. The European Union, which is really the only Europe that exists, has overcome, I think, to a certain extent, miraculously, 4 big challenges. Some of them were something that you wouldn't have expected. The first one was the situation of conflict, even war on its borders, the Balkans to Libya, and more recently in the Ukraine. We've got many examples. And the second challenge was a globalization process that has produced a lot of opportunities, but at the same time has generated a few problems. Globalization has been done irregularly in an imbalanced way. It's been financial, but not always fiscal, for instance, which has allowed the emergence of emerging countries who have introduced a new type of competition with a huge pressure on the welfare state and the social model of the Union. And this has meant a further problem after all the problems that we've had for convergence between member states without adequate implementation of this convergence, and has changed the dimension and the paradigm and the nature and scope of the problems and solutions in Europe. There are no European problems really that can be now solved entirely internally within Europe, there is always an aspect, a vector, a consequence, a need which affects the rest of the world and has to do with the rest of the world, and that is why we have to increase the strength of the European Union's role as an international player. A third challenge has been I wouldn't say that it has been happily overcome, but it hasn't been able to destroy the creature. It's made it ill, sick, but not destroyed it, and that what is a new dimension unknown before, which and has to do with something that hasn't been done properly, which is the increase in the number of countries in the European Union. Huge amount of new countries entered the beginning of the century, and these countries that entered the Union, their starting point in terms of wealth and wealth distribution were very, very different. Their economies were often 30 to 40% below the average of the European Union. Problems of malfunctioning democracy, such as in the case of Hungary and other countries, and geostrategic instabilities, which they have brought with them into the European Union. We had them in Europe, now we have them in the European Union, and we can see an example in the situation of the Baltic countries as regards the conflicts we have with Russia. And fourthly, the big crisis, recession. Recession has been quite dramatic. It's marvelous, really. It's miraculous almost that we can meet here today. I'm sorry to be I don't want to be completely pessimistic, but it's a miracle that we're here to talk about the future when the first thing we should maybe do is pat our pockets and our bodies and pinch ourselves to make sure that we are actually here, because we have been able, we've not yet overcome the crisis completely, but we have really faced up to it. This has been the most significant economic crisis, not just in our memory, in our historic memory, but in the memory of ourselves here in this room. We have done this under a policy, economic policy, single dimension, monolithic and excessive policy in its specific terms after an initial good reaction at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. There was a mobilization of public resources and expansion policy which was quite significant, more or less coordinated with the US. Then there was a stop, and we've had this monolithic obsession of consolidating public finances, which is important, accounts are important, but then there's been this corset around us which has affected even our thought. And we've not just had that restrictive policy, but we've had a lack of tools, mechanisms. The Lisbon Treaty practically doesn't add anything, just a couple of commas and some conjunctions and words, loose words, to the Maastricht Treaty in terms of monetary union. So we've really, in 2008, we sort of went back to what we already had in 1992, a currency, a central bank, which was designed restrictively, managed restrictively, focusing on us. Only one of the aims it has, or should have. It should have other aims, but it's focused on the combat of inflation. So to have faced up to the biggest crisis we've ever had with this lame policy and with that lack of instruments and mechanisms, and to have survived that and be here is a true miracle, because as we'll see now, these problems have caused huge damage. And the only explanation I find for this miracle is not just the chance, it's that, as we can see to these last few days in Greece, the will, political and democratic will of those, even those who criticize the Union most heavily, the will has been stronger than all these setbacks. There are many people that question and criticize what's being done, how it is being done, but there are very few people, except for a few fanatics, that want to leave the club. There are still more people that want to join than people that want to leave. And what is extraordinary is that in this time of crisis we have institutionally filled some of the gaps that we had. When Guillermo comes, he will develop this further. But some of the things that we were missing to have a true economic and monetary union. We were almost a monetary union, and now we are beginning to be an economic and monetary union. The bailouts, the fiscal treaties, the sketch of budgetary union through the European semester, the 2-pack, the 6-pack, all these technicalities. Banking union with all its defects, a whole series, and especially the new functions of the Central European Bank. So we are alive. It is important, of course this is not enough, because we are alive, but we are severely wounded. We're badly wounded. We've got a financial and economic fragmentation which is growing all the time. Some aspects have softened recently, but the level, for instance, of the differences in the prices of money between countries in the north and Mediterranean countries, these differences have done tremendous damage to the single market. We've had a rupture of cohesion, social cohesion. It cannot be that there is social cohesion when in one country unemployment goes down to 5%, like the leading country, and other countries it's in excess of 25%. This is not acceptable, it's just not serious, and it's inadequate whatever we do. And we've also got a certain breakup, territorial breakup, in the sense that we've taken on different flags, people of the north against people of the south, selling the Parthenon, or not having a siesta, or please don't goose march. There's been all these things being slung around. People have been criticizing and attacking each other, and I think that this is has done tremendous damage to social cohesion, and it is a high price to pay for the way things have been done so badly, and the levels of poverty, the levels of, for instance, in Spain, the fact that in Spain in the last 6-7 years we got 3 million more people unemployed. Below the threshold of poverty. We don't seem to notice because we're city dwellers with our suits and ties, but there's a huge amount of people that just can't make ends meet. That's catastrophic. And then, if I am allowed a couple of minutes, 2 things. In addition to everything we've done this year, what are we doing? What is the Union doing? And are we doing it well or not in these last months? Well, I think that the Union is very timidly beginning, without enough determination and without the proper will, is beginning to turn or to adjust its economic policies in order to introduce more of them. So there's not just a single dimension. The best example of this is the address of Jackson Hall, the ECB president, on the 23rd of August, where he spoke about a different policy mix, and for the first time a central banker gave an address, 20-page address on employment and demand, for the first time perhaps in history, because bankers have always spoken about supply, not demand. Talks about this new policy mix, adding has talked about modulating public financing systems and is investment. So all that has the central bank has developed on the basis of that fantastic measures that might be criticized if you like, and all my Cassandra friends have mentioned them, so I'll spare you them. But the main criticism is that about delay. And then we're not like the US, they say we depend more on bank financing than markets, etc., etc. But beyond all those criticisms, and in spite of all those criticisms, and I see here people who've written, who've preached in the desert about this, at least we have a situation where things have been done. We'll see how well they work, but at least let us be slightly optimistic and slightly pleased about what's been done.
The second point, I think, after seeing the new policies launched by the European Central Bank is the Juncker plan, right? The Strategic Investment Fund, this, that, and the other, which, well, all I can say is about time. There was an initial prologue where we had that pact for growth and employment back in 2012 when François Hollande made the presidency of the French Republic, and let's see what happens, because it is a different and very new idea. I have defined it as low-cost Keynesianism because it's a little bit of money attracting a lot of private investment, but I think that we will have to talk about that. We will have to further that, but definitely it is a very good step in the very right direction. And finally, this rereading of the Stability Pact, which is by the Commission on January 13 in a very nice document, which is definitely very limited because it has been designed to solve France and Italy's problem, and which synthetically begins to implement the golden rule, not the Delors golden rule and the golden rule of those who were more prone to Europe in times of the Maastricht Treaty, and that when that orthodoxy made it impossible for the golden rule to be implemented in crunching the numbers for public investments. But yes, the exemption of parts, be it the trans-European funds, the structural funds, the cohesion funds, what have you, that is good, but it's very, very tepid. It's insufficient, and it does not foster investment in those countries and parts of Europe that most need it, the more vulnerable countries, because they are running an excessive deficit, and because it is the countries of the periphery and others, but especially the countries of the periphery. So that is something that we should definitely take a new look at. But all of this is global. And then there are sectorial policies which are much, much more important, as those, at least. And I think that what we are going to do now is have the good fortune of hearing brilliant thoughts on that. Thank you very much to Xavier. Thank you. Thank you first for introducing, although very shyly, the element of optimism in these very difficult times. I have a question for you, which I will be posing to others. You've talked a little bit about the union's reactions. We've more or less sprung forward in short-term areas. There have been bailouts, those injections of money. There's another series of measures that look at the midterm solution, the design, the mechanisms, the tools, the instruments. But I think that when we think about the future, what we see is that we should be preparing for the long term. So what model of Europe do we want to compete with other not emerging at all economies, strong, robust economies? So please give me a very brief answer, because I would like at the end of this session to have the feeling that we more or less glimpse where we want to arrive at. Well, I think a very clear example of what you're addressing is the 2020 agenda, which is much better than the Lisbon agenda, which it actually substitutes for, because it addresses the issue of 4 or 5 priorities, not 25. And it doesn't say, I'm so handsome now, I'm going to continue to be handsome and I'm going to be the best ever, which is what Lisbon said. Not very good as a working methodology and very inefficient, as we have seen, which was the open method to establish coordination, which was not a method, it wasn't open, it didn't guarantee coordination, it was an absolute flop. So the 2020 agenda is a little bit better, it's a little bit better built, but it continues to miss something, it lacks something which is really important, which is to accompany all of the progress that has been achieved with more political union. We need more unity, we need a more profound federal, I hope that there's no British national here listening to us, more political control, if you will, of that union. And the Parliament has very shyly begun to take some steps, but not enough. And we can't just abide by the Parliament. I mean, we continue to see this short-term approach, that intergovernmentalism, which is so nefarious for us. So we're not being successful at all in it being where we should be at the right time because of this precisely. So it's very difficult if you think about it. Governments at the same time, simultaneously, well, you have the artists and you have the guilty parties. You have the doers and the non-doers. Very difficult. We wish that the new challenges that we face now, so now Greece. Well, let's hope that Greece is channeled, and you know, since we're always playing chicken, we're always at the edge of the abyss. Well, let's see whether this time around and the upcoming times we react a little bit more proactively. But we need this thing that we say, this empowerment, the Anglo-Saxon empowerment of societies. Well, let's go ahead and let's empower. If it's empowering, well, let's empower. It's adding that political dimension, aware of the fact that we have a very difficult political scenario because some of the ones have taken power and they're going completely against the grain, saying let's take this apart. Well, we don't, those of us who don't want to take this apart, let's pick up speed and let's have loudspeakers. Well, we're going to hear now how citizens can, in fact, become empowered. I'm going to stand up because I know for a fact that I speak better standing up. Now, I don't have a text with me, but I have some images. I wanted to contribute, but from a different vantage point. It's actually difficult to link the future of Europe without thinking about human capital. Not only because this is the knowledge society, but also because the future resides on natural resources. And when we talk about the future of Europe, I wonder whether we're talking about inequality, because one of the facts, the economic facts that is not often referred to is that there is a relationship, a direct negative relationship between inequalities and growth. In other words, those countries that are more unequal grow less. And what's interesting is that the reason is that when a country has more inequalities, it invests less in the education of its citizens because there's fewer resources. So when we're looking at the future of Europe and when we're looking at how to solve the issue of inequalities, what we have to look at is knowledge, education, and human capital. So what I'm going to do is see how the combination of demographic change, globalization, and technology are the factors that have affected the banking system, the media, music, how all also affects education and what this actually means for Europe. So let's look at the demographics. Here's your European family in 1915. I don't know whether you can see this at the back of the room, but look at their faces. They have a tough time of it. So life expectancy for all of these people was 35 years. There were a lot of problems. These people were about to enter into a conflict that would cost 30 million lives, but they didn't have one issue to worry about, which was future generations. There's 11 people, it's 2 generations. Who works for who sustains who, and who guarantees the future of whom? This is a European family in 2015. It's true that it's not your average family, but it is a plausible family. Everybody's well fed. Everybody smiles. They're better cared for. They have better health care. They live better. Look at that baby. That baby born this year, if it's a Spanish baby, will live 85 years. Not 35, 85. But there's a problem, and it is intergenerational solidarity. Who is going to support and sustain whom? And here is a more specific vision of Spain. This is what it means. Look at this. This is Spain back in 1955. That's half a century ago. The pyramid in Spain seemed to be relatively healthy. The bottom was nice and strong, but look at the upper portion. Look at that. In 1955, in Spain, there were very few persons aged over 85. This is Spain in 2020. What do we see? Well, not only is the bottom part narrower, you see that? Look at that. That's a pyramid which is coming up, but look at that going northwards. Not only are there a lot of people aged between 85 and 100, but that is the proportion of persons in Spain that is most quickly growing. Now, these three numbers that you see up on top, what do they mean? Well, let's take a look at them and let's remember them. In Spain, in 2050, 90% of the population will be either under 16 or over 65, which means that in view of the current state of affairs, we're going to have 1 out of every 10 Spaniards will be of a working age. Now, this is huge. And what I'm thinking about today is that this is tremendously telling on the efforts we will have to undertake in the field of productivity in all segments of the population in order to ensure sustainability. Well, if that was the demographics, let's look at globalization now. I wanted to give you a little bit of information regarding the global breakdown of talent. This is a snapshot of the world in 2000, at the beginning of this century. This is the population between 25 and 24 years of age holding a university degree. I don't know whether you can read this or not. There were 90 million people in the world, roughly, and the distribution, look at that. 17% of the world's population is in the States. And the same proportion, Chinese, 10% Japanese, 10-12% Russian, 3% Spaniards. This is 2020. China now represents practically 1/3 of the world's population with this education. So it's 200 million people in the world with university studies. Spain is at 1%, Japan is 4%. This is the consequence of their demographic evolution. And what's very interesting is that if I were to give you the same table for the year 2040, I'm not going to give you the details, but in 2040, there's going to be not 90, not 200 like now, 400 million people in the world with a university title under their belt between 25 and 34 years of age. Now, we know that, unlike what was thought 30 years ago, it's capital following talent and not the other way around. It's very important for Europe to think about the distribution of talent. We want to create and retain talent. So let's now talk a little bit about technology, because this is also interesting. See how the world has changed. This is a French surgery in 1915. It's going to be a busy hospital. France lost 1,700,000 persons, victims, and millions of wounded persons. So that's a century ago. This is your surgery in 2015. It could be anywhere in Barcelona, in Madrid, anywhere. Take a look at that. Take your surgeon, a surgeon from 1915, and bring that surgeon to this surgery. And you'll see that the only thing that surgeon knows how to do is sweep the floor. Because the technology, the science, the collaboration, the knowledge, it's all changed so much that the surgeon wouldn't even recognize the toolkits. And now, look at a classroom. A classroom in 1915. Sad place, isn't it? You can see how spare the rod and spoil the child That's a whole lot of children looking at the teacher, and look at the classroom now in 2015. Or not. Why? Well, it does look like a happier place. There are girls, okay, so it's co-ed, good news for everyone. There's more color. It seems to be a more relaxed setting, but if you were to take a teacher from 1915 and bring that teacher to any classroom in Europe today, that teacher with the right book will be teaching immediately. Immediately. She'll know what the classroom is like, she'll know what she's doing, and she'll know, just as she knew back in 1915, what education is all about. Education who dictates his or her knowledge without any intelligence being contributed by anyone. The dictated words are jotted down. So we haven't really come a very long way in terms of education. But it's very shocking. It's surprising, isn't it, to see how slowly education evolves if you compare it with the changes in any other scenes. And this is in Spain. We're not talking about a backward country. Think about Oxford. In Oxford, there's proof that back in the year 1096 classes were being taught. Women were included as faculty in Oxford as of October 7, 1920. So it was practically 1,000 years before women were brought on board. And there was a quota of women. 25% of students could be women. You couldn't have more than 25% women students until 1957. So yes, there's been change, and it's been good change, but it's taken a while. And just as in Spain as in the rest of continental Europe, back in 1955, with that pyramid, only 10% of the Spanish population held a university degree. Now it's over 40. I think it's 43% of the population, which is absolutely wonderful, but very slow. So, the question is, education, is it going to undergo the same kind of a tsunami that other parts of our society have had to survive? Well, I would say yes. I would say yes. So let me explain why. This is a classroom. Those of you who are at the back of the room might think it's a normal classroom. So it's students sitting at their desk with a couple of computers. What you maybe don't see is something special. Up on the ceiling, there's these cables that go down into each student's desk and give them amino acids so they can study for longer. This is a real photograph of a school in Hubei in China. These students are being given medication back in 2012 so that these kids can study for longer hours. Why? Well, in China they have this thing called Gaokao, which is like an exam, a nationwide exam in June. And you have 9-10 million students, fewer now because this is very expensive. This photograph exists because this was surprising even in China, but the school principal said yeah, it's tough, but you know, this exam is really important. These students want to study, they want to pass, and I have a subsidy. It's €2 per day per student. Now, I don't know what this is, but I don't think this is education, having students on drugs to pass an exam. But what this is, I think, all about is that this talks about a fundamental difference between Europe and the rest of the world. And it's not the crisis, it's not inequality, because the rest of the world also has inequalities which are much more than ours. It's not the welfare state crisis, because most of the world doesn't have a crisis in their welfare state because they don't have a welfare state. The difference is that we don't believe in our future, and especially we don't believe in the power of transformation inherent to education. What this image tells us is that there is an attempt, a desperate attempt, pathetic, sad, of humanity to achieve progress via education. It's individual and it's collective at the same time. If you see what is spent by the European Union, its GDP in education, it's 5.3%, Spain 4.5%. South Africa, Brazil, China, Mexico spend more than we do in education in relative terms to its GDP. And this means that despite their inequalities, they believe that the future resides in education. And my final words address the issue of the impact of technology in the way we learn and teach, which is not, TV or distance training. Let me give you, if I have 2 minutes, let me share an example with you. Allow me 2 minutes. There's a person whose name is Christensen, who is a teacher at Harvard, and he wrote a well-known book which is called The Innovator's Dilemma. He's a guru. He focuses on innovation. And he was at the University of Phoenix, which is a tiny online university. And they said, could you give us 10 classes that we could, tape and give as an online course? So he went to talk with the dean, and he said, Phoenix? Phoenix, are you sure? Well, your free time, sure. And not inside our building, and no logo of ours, so as not to tarnish Harvard's prestige. Well, go ahead. So he talked to the Phoenix people, and he said, okay, here's your building, here's your classroom. And what he did was he began to talk so that he could be taped. And after 5 minutes, he stopped talking. Why? Because he realized that the entire classroom was girls and boys who were incredibly beautiful. Young people, Brad Pitts, Angelina Jolie's, and he said, where am I? Where do you study? And the answer was, no, we're actors. We don't study, we've been hired. Because we want to look really good, especially when you're saying something that is not particularly interesting. So that, they look at you and say, if this incredibly beautiful girl is interested, this must be interesting. And when Mr. Christensen saw the result of his class, he saw that his PowerPoint had become an interactive experience, which was just absolutely wonderful. So what did he learn? Well, he learned a couple of things. He learned, first, you don't need to be the world's greatest researcher to be a really good teacher. What's more, it's practically better not to be the world's greatest researcher, because Humboldt, back in 1810, talks about research and teaching is superfluous with technology in mind. And the second learning, which is much more interesting, is that Professor Christensen said, how much does Harvard spend in the quality of its teachings? And the answer is 0. How much does Phoenix spend? Everything. Because that is its raison d'etre. Which tells us what? Which tells us that what changes with technology are not online courses. It's not the small lectures that you see on a TV screen. It's the business model of education. It's the way you teach and learn. And it is especially what we define as knowledge. Knowledge is not the transmission of knowledge. No. It's the way information is transmitted. It's collaborative. It's increasingly complex networks in situations that are uncertain. And if you analyze a European university, continental European, not as a source of information, but rather as the possibility of being flexible, collaborative, working nimbly in a context which is full of uncertainties, well, you'll realize that we have got to really strive to ensure that the university responds to the needs of the citizens and the societies of the future. And I believe that this is really the path towards less inequalities and a better economic future. Thank you very much.
Se me olvidó.
Oops, and I forgot. There's a lot of academic experience, and people can only keep one idea in their minds, and the idea that I want you to take away is this. I'm sorry, but I can't read it from the booth. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Xavier. Un repaso fácil.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting indeed. I have a lot of questions, but I will pose 2 for very brief answers, and we can continue afterwards with the other speakers. You've described very well the impact of higher education on European demographics. But many of the problems that have to do with inequalities have to do with that portion of the European population that lacks this education. Before, we heard Mr. Marco Riccardo Rusconi talk about plans to industrialize Europe, but how in the short term can we close that gap between the population who is currently unemployed because they worked in sectors, obviously Spain is the model country, in sectors that didn't call for skilled labor, and they have their future right ahead of them. So the second question has to do with another very important factor, education-wise and work-wise, and that has to do with mobility. Just this week I read information which says that among Erasmus students, there's 30% less unemployment levels than among other university students. Erasmus is always put forward as the best model of a true integratory program of Europe, a program that has truly contributed to having European citizens. What else could we do? Well, in the 45 minutes that you're going to give me to answer the first question, in a nutshell, in a country such as Spain, I think that what we should do is debate openly, because it seems that any relationship between the labor and the education world implies that there's some kind of a prostitution. No, education should not be at the service of the economy, but we should be allowing students to avail themselves of the education that they have accrued. And as to your second question, mobility. Well, Erasmus, mobility, it shouldn't be me criticizing Erasmus, should it? But it is important to think about the proportion. Erasmus affects 5 million students, and the budget has grown tremendously, and I'm very proud of that. But we need to be aware of the fact that it's like Oxford, you know? You're not really sure whether Oxford is full of people who learn a lot and are geniuses, or maybe the selection is such that the people who arrive in Oxford, well, they don't care whether it's a chimp teaching because they're brilliant in and of themselves. I'm exaggerating, of course. Now, of course, yes, people who complete an Erasmus are more successful in that way, but this is probably because of the attitude, and probably also because of the family setting of Erasmus students. But of course, we need to have more transparency and a more international approach to education. And I have to say that technology is wonderful because you can actually become international from the comfort of your living room. In a model such as the Italian or the Spanish systems, just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking in Italy to a group of rectors, and there's something that we have got to say. It does not depend on the money, it depends on the wherewithal. Between 2007 and 2013, 94, I repeat, % of the graduates in Italy were within the same university, which can be remedied if you encourage any person who graduates from a university to not be allowed to teach there until they've taught somewhere else. This is why at the beginning of the 20th century, the North American system became as good as it has become. And this is why I insist mobility is very, very important. But it's a way of seeing the future of education and understanding that we need not competition in a market sense, but we need to be competitive in seeking excellence. Thank you very much. And now Carlos Alvarez is going to tell us how sustainability, the environment, ecology, seeking for a different society affects us when we think about designing the future of Europe. Carlos, please.
Well, thank you very much to the Foundation for organizing this debate, which is teaching me a lot, and for being so bold enough to invite me. I don't know whether that was a good thing, because when you come third after two such brilliant speakers, in addition to the honor of being here, one has the challenge of saying something that is relevant. I am going to try to do that and to be provocative, and I'm going to try to give you a perspective that complements and rounds off the previous two visions, with which I agree, by the way. The first message is that the time, not the weather today, but in Spanish time means weather too. The time dimension is very important. When we talk about economy, automatically and almost without realizing, we focus on the short term. We focus on the short term. Normally, on the news and even in newspapers, One of the main items of news as regards the economy is the stock exchange news, what's happened with the financial markets, and that is, there's nothing more short-term than that. And one of the messages that I wanted to leave with you, Xavier is very right. You've got to try and leave at least one message. I'll see which one I choose. But the first one is, let's look at the longer term. Basically, that's the opposite to what we've done to date. We've been, for 7 years, in a situation of crisis, and we've been acting in the short term. We've often been working as if we were firemen because the euro was sinking, etc. But the most urgent thing, paradoxically, is to think in the long term. If we have a longer term view, we see, for instance, and many indicators can be looked at, but we can see what's happened with GDP of certain areas or countries between 2004 and 2014, 10 years. A 10-year cycle where, by the way, half of them were expansion years and half of them were crisis years. And we look at Japan, 2004, Japan was at 105. And basically, in terms of GDP, the same as 2008 when the crisis began. The Eurozone was at 107 as regards 2004, practically at the same point that as in 2008. The US, 117 as regards 2004, 7 or 8 digits above the situation, that situation in 2008. And Sweden is 123, that is, their growth was even greater than that of the US. I'm talking about rich countries, not the rest of the world. 123, and then they were at 108 as regards they are now at 108 as regards 2008. So these results are quite different over a time of 10 years. The interpretation of the people responsible for the Eurozone is a single discourse telling us that we are lacking structural reforms. This is what we hear day in, day out, and I'm sure it is true, but I think that the most important structural reform is the one that we don't remember about, or the one we don't want to think about, which sort of comes up against our taboos, our own thought. And that structural reform has not been done within the Eurozone. Paradigm of economic governance of the Eurozone, with variations over time and from country to country, is basically the same that we had in 2004, and it comes from further back. Basically the same we had at the beginning of the crisis. And that structural reform, we are afraid to face it. We talk about innovation all the time, but we don't innovate within the conceptual paradigm in which we're working. That paradigm, conceptual paradigm, says finances, from the economic point of view, private finances are the center of the system. They lead to private investment. Private investment leads to jobs. Jobs lead to consumption. And maybe as a fifth result, well-being and welfare are improved. I like what Xavier said very much. He said that talent doesn't follow capital, capital follows talent. That's a different way of looking at the same cycle. And in addition to that cycle, where private finances are the hub and core of the system, there's something which I think is debatable, and that is that for private finances to go well and generate private investment, we've got to ensure that we have a macroeconomic context which is dogmatically rigid, and hope that certain, or in the belief that certain parameters are key for everything to work. And that is where we are right now. And we are afraid to interfere with it for reasons. I'm not saying let's throw that paradigm away and use another one, but we're not even trying to experiment. And I think that Europe talks about innovation all the time, and we have to start to experiment as regards the paradigm, because what produces results are very poor, comparative terms. I don't want to simplify things too much, but I think that the economic governance paradigm that has been used, based on the two examples I've given you, which are very different, Switzerland and the US, are substantially different from what we as Europeans in the European Union use. There are significant differences, so don't let's boil everything down to a single paradigm and a single thing. Conclusion is that results and outcomes are poor, but we are told we are lacking structural reforms. These structural reforms were in a context in Spain where we would all be delighted to adhere to the optimism of the government and say the crisis is over, etc. But that is not what citizens and people are perceiving. As Max Weber said, perceptions are what count. People are not perceiving that because those structural reforms, in the case of Spain, but not only Spain, have led us to, or one might say that they've led us to, a model of low cost, a low cost model of a country. We're a low cost country at the micro level, and you'd probably be afraid to see what people actually, the wages that people make, very highly qualified people make in Spain, the salaries that they're being offered if they get a job. Low cost in the sense that in this process of structural reforms we've reduced investment in education, health and research, innovation and development, and that's tremendously bad for our future. And low cost because in this whole process we haven't done something which is indispensable, and that is to improve the quality of our processes, political, economic, institutional. And we haven't bothered about this. And what I'm trying to say from a longer term view is that we need to pay attention to another paradigm, which we might call, and in fact it's the name of an initiative that's been financed by the Commission, which is what we might call socio-ecological transition, whose beginnings date to 40 years ago when the Club of Rome and other institutions and other players, by the way very European, with a global vision but very European, said our model for development is not sustainable and incompatible with the ecosystem. This was said by the Club of Rome 40 years ago. Now, what we've seen in these last 30, 40 years and in these 10 years of crisis is that the wealthier countries have, to feed the growth, the pure growth of the GDP, has required an amount, a very substantial amount of financing and debt in such a way that a large part of that growth, and we know about that in Spain, was artificial, the bubble, the construction sector bubble. The problem of debt is that excessive debt eats up the less renewable of resources, the least renewable of resources, which is our future. And we are eating up our future in an extraordinary manner. We are getting into debt in order to grow, and that is not right. And we've got to try and experiment and try out other paradigms that are very different. One of the key words here is decoupling between prosperity, growth and our financial debt. If we are feeding welfare through debt, we are condemning future generations, and we are feeding and nurturing conflicts in Europe in the future between debtors and creditors. And if we do not decouple all that, not just prosperity, welfare and debt, but welfare, prosperity and consumption of non-renewable resources, well, what we're going to do is we're going to nurture the greatest ecological crisis that you can imagine, which will fall upon us in the future, and which is actually already upon us. So, and to finish on an upbeat note, in spite of everything I've just said, I am going to give you another take-home message and then another more optimistic message. In order to move forward in that socio-ecological transition, there's a significant difference as regards the past, especially for Spain, but the rest of Europe too. There's no reference model. Nobody's done it in the world. How do you do it? We don't know. Nobody's done it on a large scale. Things are being done on a smaller scale. And one of the key messages is that there seems to be something that is critical when you haven't got a reference model to use, and that is process quality. The quality of the processes with which you experiment in institutional innovation, in particular, citizen participation, at least within the European model, is essential. And very probably cities are a key part because they're a microcosmos of the world. They are the world on a small scale, and you can look at politics, economic institutions and technology within cities and build new solutions. And the optimistic note is that paradoxically, I liked what you said about we don't believe in our future. This is cause for despair, but we have a lot of elements and aspects available to us to initiate that socio-ecological transition. One of the very few examples there are of large-scale decoupling is Denmark. Denmark has decoupled their growth from their consumption of energy, of power. So they consume in absolute terms basically the same amount of power, but they're still growing in GDP. And there are other examples throughout Europe. So the only thing, what we need to do is to break away from the dogma that is imprisoning us. One of the speakers mentioned the word corset. Do that structural reform within of our own framework of thought and be daring as regards the future and have trust in the possibility to construct that sustainable prosperity in the future. Thank you.
Damos la bienvenida a Guillermo de la Dehesa, pero antes quiero...
Good, thank you. We welcome Guillermo de la Dehesa, but I want to make a question, ask him a question. You've given examples, specific examples. Denmark, for instance. Do you see anything that the institutions are doing that can lead us to that paradigm? Xavier was talking about the 2020 agenda, which has come to a slight standstill as a result of the crisis, or has slowed down. Carlos, do you think we have a basis for progress? Or is this an intellectual, abstract notion that might develop or might not? No, there are many things. There are two things here. From the point of view of the institutions in Europe, especially, this change of paradigm is not at the core of the governance paradigm. This is quite obvious. It's infrastructural, it's collateral. But if you scratch the surface, you see that there have been many initiatives that have been taken in Europe, because there's also a line of inequality here between the north and the south, northern countries. And we in the south have to learn and not just criticize, learn from them. Legitimate to complain about the rigidity of the north, but we must also learn from them. And if you look at what Germany and the northern countries are doing in eco-sustainability, they're doing a lot of things, and accepting, for the institutions have to accept that this is an indispensable part of the agenda. There is huge variation within Europe geographically, but this is not at the core of the institutional concepts at the highest level, although it is behind the financing. A lot of those initiatives are being financed through the 2020 agenda, the framework program by the Commission. And the second thing is that this is not about a top-down approach. This is not about an illustrated, enlightened elite, because politically it's impossible in Europe and the Western world. Another issue would be if we spoke about China, but we're not talking about China. We're talking about Europe, and this cannot work because an enlightened elite suddenly sees the light and leads us forward, because people in Europe are beginning to get fed up with that. And this requires what we call polycentrism, which Mira Nostrom, the Nobel Prize for Economy, underlined a lot. This concept of polycentrism. Many centres, many hubs, many cores. And it reminds us of the subsidiarity principle in Europe, to make decisions at very different levels, and it's preferable to make decisions at levels where the information is the best at the lowest cost. That is very, very close to the ground, to where things are happening. And maybe what institutions, highest level institutions, should do is create an environment that makes it, that propitiates that polycentrism and changes the nature of the paradigm. Thank you very much, Guillermo. To put you in the picture, we've gone over the trajectory, the what's happened in Europe at macro level in recent years. We've gone through, looked at demographics, education, the effect that might have on employment, and the need to innovate also in terms of governance in order to take a leap ahead. So I think you've got to deal with tax issues, monetary, fiscal union, etc. Well, I'm quite pessimistic. Not just because I mean I'm looking at the real hard data, and the 18 countries are doing very badly. We are practically stagnant. We've got deflation, and the other 10 countries that have not entered into this, into stagnation, are growing at 2-3%. All of them. With normal rates of inflation, and we have deflation, and we have a problem, a tremendous problem, because of course in an optimum monetary area, which is not the case, there would have to be fiscal and monetary policies, but we've only got monetary policies, and the fiscal policy is the only one that helps to avoid to prevent asymmetric shocks. We've just had an asymmetric shock, very significant, in some of the southern countries in Europe, and plus Ireland. And however, there is no European institution at this time that can help, because the budget, European budget, just accounts for 1% of the GDP of Europe, which is nothing. And if you add the ESM and the ESF and all these other funds, they've very little money. Even the European Investment Bank, their figures are small, they're modest. So, in the US, instead of 1% of the GDP, the federal government accounts for more than 20% of the GDP in the country. California has had a problem. There was 16% of the GDP of the US. They've solved the problem in months. In months. They've started to pay. They've started to inject cash. They've started to pay unemployment benefits. And they have, the minute they've started injecting cash, the Governor General of California, which was paying with IOUs, was paying people with IOUs because they had no money. Banks paid out those IOUs at face value, and they've started to do so. That doesn't exist here. So, and what's more, we have an excess of money in current accounts, or an excess in current accounts. Because why? Because countries that are doing well are not, their internal demand is not increasing. We sell 70% of what we sell it to Europe. within the European Union. The countries that are doing well, their demand hasn't been going up, especially Germany. We can't export to them. We export to Portugal more than we do to the whole of Spanish America, which is pretty crazy because the euro the euro was created so that we don't have an exchange rate risk, and that's crazy. We're locked in a trap. We're trapped in a prison, and we can't get out of it because there's no internal demand. And for us, or supply rather, for us within the European Union, and that is a very complex problem. And I think that if we don't do something new, because this Juncker plan is you know, they're filling in figures artificially. It's all wishful thinking. A lot of it, not all of it, a lot of it. In general, it's just wishful thinking, and it would be wonderful if we could, you know, get 15 billion going by just increasing or starting from 15 billion. On the basis of 15 billion, we arrive at 315 billion. So it's all leveraged. It's all debt. It's all debt. There's no money coming from anywhere. So if we've got no fiscal policy, and countries that are doing better, if they don't increase their internal demand, we're not going to go anywhere. Who are you going to sell the goods to? That's my opinion. And at some stage, this is going to come to a head because at the end of the day, everybody loses out. If we lose and we're their market, they will also lose. Politics have dominated the scene. All these issues of austerity, and of course the other countries that have not entered stagnation are growing, and they're within Europe. You mentioned the Juncker plan, and you've mentioned the Draghi plan, this mix that has just been announced. What's your opinion? He's a hero. We ought to build a statue to him. We should build him a statue because he's a hero, because since what he said is, since there cannot be asymmetric, the fiscal policy cannot support fiscal asymmetric financing, I will do it, he said. How's he going to do it? He's injecting money, buying bonds, buying debt, private debt, so that those who sell it, banks, institutions, companies, etc., families, have cash. So they can spend money. They can go out and spend their money. They can go shopping. They can consume and make investment increase. And thanks to him, this has been this has not ended badly. It hasn't ended in tragedy, because both Germany, if it leaves the euro, will go broke, and if Greece leaves the euro, it will go broke. Germany, because
el marco se apreciaría de una manera tan...
Because the Deutschmark would shoot up in value in such a way that they'd have a tremendous problem. They'd have to live off their own internal demand, and they haven't done so to date. The same happens in Greece. If they leave the euro, there's going to be a devaluation of 70, 80, 90%, and that would be good. A lot of tourists would rush into Greece and to Athens to spend their money. I mean, you imagine a devaluation of 90%, but of course they've got no infrastructure to support that. There's more infrastructure in Majorca than in the whole of the Greek islands. The whole of Greece, twice, double the infrastructure in Majorca. So they've got a monumental problem. So if there's a rupture, we're all going to lose. So we've just got to wait for politicians to discover the solution? Thank you. I cannot resist a question. It's in the news every day. How do you think the Greek problem is going to be solved? And will that be used as a model for reorientating management of affairs in Europe? I'm going to launch that question, then we'll have very, very quickly 3 questions from the audience, and then we've got the coffee. Xavier, Carlos, Guillermo, can you tell us your opinion about what's going to happen with Greece? What's going to happen with Greece? What might happen with Greece? Is it going to be a model, or is it just going to be a patch for the puncture? Well, I think that if everybody is more or less intelligent, which is to ask a lot, I know, some agreement will be reached. We have been now, we got this new government in Greece has been in power for 10 days, and we know some of what, we know at least to what extent this will not, what will not happen. They're not going to take away any of their debt. They're not going to condone any of their debt. And the Greek government has rushed around madly, but they know that that's not acceptable. They're just not going to get condoned. Their debt's not going to get condoned. Even the most sympathetic governments and states are not prepared to condone their debt, and that is a fact. So they have had to accept that, and the proof of that is how the Minister for the Economy, what he said in London about the change of paradigm as regards the condonation or condoning of more than 50% of the Greek debt, which had been proposed by a couple of swap operations, debt swap operations. One is probably more possible than the other, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I don't know what they're going to do, but if everybody is a bit more reasonable and realistic, and we get in the other person's shoes, we'll be able to arrive at a solution. We're going to have to be generous with Greece. We're going to have to condone some of the, make up for some of the, for this sacrifice they've made, and it would have to be a very European style solution. It should be enough for the Greek people, who are justifiably angry, and they are very angry, and they are looking at blaming other people, and the same is being done in other countries. But these Greek people must be given some kind of satisfaction, and some of the situations that are, some of the things that are going on in Greece are just unacceptable. We cannot have 300,000 families in Greece with no electricity, and children in the street with no food. I mean, it's just not acceptable, and it's not so expensive. We're not talking about 7% of the GDP. I think that was excessive. You know, and some of these things have to be solved. You know, we've got to give them some kind of satisfaction, and in return, we've got to demand from them as much as we reasonably can, and we've got to find that balance. If nothing happens or goes wrong, the problem is that when you're playing these games, some fool might come along and cause an accident. Or an accident might happen because a market suddenly behaves unexpectedly. But I think if nothing happens by February, and especially by July, then a package of measures will be put together. Probably a third bailout. They'll call it something else, but it won't be the Troika, because the Troika's time has come, because after the 14th. The ruling of the General Attorney of the 14th, the Troika cannot play on both sides of the field, or the fence. They can't be on both sides of the table. So I think that this is, I'm not saying that I'm going to be optimistic, but I think that we would have to be realistic, and we've got to get everybody involved at the level of politics, negotiation, win-win operations, and not just, you know, be negative. about things. You know, both parties. It's not a question of blaming everybody for everything. We've got to find a balance.
Well, I hope to summarize things, but I have no idea what's going to happen. But please, let's all hope that it comes to a good ending. There's a couple of things we need to remember. First, in view of the events of the past 5 years, well, this is what Jean Galbraith talked about the real true function of the economy, which is to turn astrology into a respectable profession. Now, it's not the economic forecasts that are going to make a difference. No, it's a political issue. And I would allow myself 2 comments about the political problem we face. First, and this is very important, we shouldn't be surprised if the European Union takes decisions at the very last moment, when everything's been approved, when it's horrible to hear the clock ticking. But time is an incentive. When Mrs. Merkel or Mr. Tsipras have to reach an agreement which is going to be difficult to explain to their clients, to their citizens, all they can do is say, we've tried everything else and it didn't work. So the European Union is not a demos, it's not a national state. We don't have an authoritative European government, so it's not really surprising that everything is very dramatic. This happened decades ago with the Common Agricultural Policy to decide about the fate of a couple of thousand tons of potatoes. You had to meet at 4 in the morning because otherwise French or Spanish farmers didn't understand why the potato was going to be that cheap. Well, now something's happening which is even more serious. I think that at the end of the day, the problems we face today with Greece and that we've seen in recent years are basically due to 2 very important issues. One is the naivete. We're naive ever since the establishment of the European Union, thinking that member states can be kidded along to supranationality. They can be lied to. Well, this was possible insofar as integration wasn't true, but now integration is for real. So there's no kidding anyone. And then another fact that we need to bear into account is that it's very, very difficult to explain to a German citizen or a Dutch citizen why even a tiny portion of his or her taxes have to go to another country. In abstract terms, you understand that, but a country that traditionally has been a receptor, and in Spain, we might be skeptics, but it's associated with a highway that says FEDER. We don't realize how difficult it is for the political classes, I repeat, in Europe, very difficult to convince the citizens of this. It's very difficult to ask Greeks to further shrink beyond 25% their wealth. And it's just as difficult to ask a German citizen to try and understand this. I'm not justifying anything. All I'm saying is that these are very difficult actions, and it's inherently difficult to build something which really has much more coverage than what was suspected initially. And I say, it's naive to think about having a single currency, a single tax policy, but this is part and parcel of the simplistic approach to the construct of Europe in the first half century of its life. I think it's difficult to explain to citizens the Greek case. As Guillermo points out, the thing is that politicians need to take a reality check and forget about the dogma. Because you can really talk about many examples. I think that the Greek case is going to give us food for thought and writing for many, many years. I'm not sure whether it's going to be Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, or Greek surrealism. Guillermo has just given a beautiful example. Look at California, the most populated state in the Union, the first economy of the United States of America has had to be bailed out. And it's been bailed out by the federal government. Greece has us not sleeping well. Well, I don't have an answer, but I think that definitely there is leeway for actions to be undertaken by Europe. And if not, there's something which isn't working. Because, you know, it's not just California. Think about Spain. It's as if the entire economy of Spain depended on the province of Rioja, which defaults. You see? I mean, hello. wake up and smell the coffee. We have to explain this. I mean, the Riojanos have been terrible and they've spent the money and they're spendthrifts, but it's the province of Rioja. And I love Rioja. I'm wonderful. I think they're wonderful. And I'm sure that we have good friends among them. But, you know, this is a very graphic example. This is Greece to the European Union. So this is surrealism, and it is a result of a governance which is very imperfect. Yes, well, why is it so difficult then to talk about Catalonia? Don't look at me. I'm okay talking about Catalonia and explaining Catalonia, but you know, we could talk about Catalonia. No, that's something for another rainy day. Now, I believe this is very straightforward. I believe that we cannot run the risk of having Greece leave Europe, because that is exactly and precisely acknowledging that we're botching it, that we're doing a terrible job, and that cannot be, because the day after, the markets are going to wallop us. It's going to be like the end of it all, and others will fall on day 2. So we cannot run the risk. I mean, you know, we're trying to hold things together with Band-Aids. You're at the extreme of it. And at the end of the day, you realize I cannot afford that risk, and you have to lend a hand. The Greeks have not helped very much. I was in Greece when Papandreou said we're broke, and a group of economists, among them your humble servant, was sent there. And let me tell you, this was a party. Nobody paid taxes. I mean, they didn't even pay taxes on houses. Everybody had electricity, but they weren't really paying for the electricity. I mean, everything was the underground, the very blackest of economies. That is the way that country works. And practically half of the population, of the working population, is employed by the government with very low wages, but it's the government. It's a different country, but they are a member of the Union before Spain was, and before Portugal. Watch out for that. And of course, they're part of the Union. You always had the Turkey issue. Turkey had massacred the Greeks, this and that. Greece, it is true, is the cradle of democracy in the world. So they benefit from those privileges, but that country is not well managed. It has never been well managed. Very, very quickly, 3 questions. I'm going to ask you to please tell us who you are, tell us who the question is for, and 3, keep them very, very short. Can you hear me, says the gentleman. Thank you. I'm going to... Please tell us who you are. I'm Jose Luis Escario. I'm with the Foundation Alternativas, and I'm interested in the issue of unequal globalization. Financial, yes, but not in terms of taxes. We continue to have our national glasses on when we talk about taxation. And this is even more noticeable in the European Union, which has a single market, where you have free circulation of capitals, where we have seen the beginning of broaching the tax issue, what with expenses, what with measures of governance after the sovereign debt crisis. But we continue to see the European Union sort of stuck on the income thing. I'm pro-Europe myself, but it was the implementation of legislation from the states that unblocks a directive on bank secrecy, which had been blocked in the Council for 7 years, I think. European countries, when the time came to abide by US legislation, the G5 has finally unblocked a directive which was blocked by Luxembourg and Austria. And the same goes for double taxation. It would seem that only the European Union was interested in large companies not have double taxation, but for years they were not concerned about double non-taxation, which are actually terrible for member states. We've had to wait until the OECD and the G20 launch a global initiative before we begin to think about double non-taxation. And now the LuxLeaks scandal, I think, might be a turning point. We have come to realize that over 340 major corporations are paying about 2% and not 22%. Some are paying 1%. And we've seen that the President of the Commission has launched an initiative to once again look at another directive which has been blocked for years, which is the common base, the common consolidated base, which is what the US has, harmonization of taxes in a nutshell. So what would you have to say about this, which is so very important for public deficits? So not only focus on the expenses, we've come a long way expense-wise, but this coordination from the point of view of income. Are there more questions? Yes? And these two questions are going to be enough. Hello, thank you very much. I come from the Embassy of Poland, and as Guillermo says, I think it's very interesting to hear that the Juncker plan is very promising, but we're not really sure whether the promises will make good. Thank you very much, Mr. Draghi. Juncker, we're not that sure. So what is it that we have? What is it that can actually get our economies moving? Because everything you've said is refers to the very distant future. Long term, well, we're going to have to hold on, do our best. Because if we want to have a fiscal union, we're going to have a change in the treaties. And the change in the treaties can very well take up to a decade. As of the moment they're proposed or suggested. So there have been attempts, but there are countries where a referendum is needed prior to introducing any change in the treaties. So we're thinking into the future, 10 or 15 years into the future, and in the meantime we need to fix it. And since everything is at the very edge of the precipice, and only then will steps be taken, well, this is where we are. We muddle through. I'm not sure how you would actually say to muddle through in Spanish. Champeando is the suggestion. That's the only way. That's the only way. We have to continue to muddle through, do our best. But it is, in fact, a very serious issue. I agree. I agree. This is like Frankenstein. The first directive that you referred to, not the last one, 14 years, the one about exchanging information. This is terrible. But now, after the semester, after the two-pack, the Commission has competencies to examine and devolve processes. There seems to be something that is a mismatch, a major mismatch, and to harmonize not a tax, but the basis for a tax, that's going to take us forever and a year. But I don't know whether it's really necessary. I don't know whether it's necessary to wait for the treaties to be reformed, because if that were the case, it's never going to happen. Maybe we could think about reinforced cooperation. Maybe that would be a way. Maybe the Eurozone could cooperate. So there again, we're talking about the will, the political will to progress. We're talking about democratic control of the economic union, which is what we were talking about, of course. I don't even think it would be mandatory to compare with the US. Guillermo said something which is absolutely on the spot, because it really is a wake-up call when you talk about budget to budget. The mechanism, the legal mechanism in place in the union whereby a judge in the middle of nowhere has to abide by community legislation, well, that really streamlines the administration. So maybe if we thought about multiplying by 2 or 3 the European budget, well, we could do 100,000 more things And that would be also more to the point than subsidizing onions. You know, I mean, you've got education, you've got research and development, and so on. And then I see also that skepticism is on the rise even in Poland, and I'm worried about that because, you know, the Spain of the Baltic is skeptical. We're, you know, not going anywhere. I think that we should perhaps be a little bit more trusting. We can afterwards ask for results. Mr. Juncker, what's going to happen to this fund? Yes, it is new, but there are new elements. Now there's private money flowing the world over, looking for investments. Decent, not negative investments, like that, at your fingertips. Now, if that could be mobilized, maybe you could think about major leveraging at the beginning, which is not to say that it's going to be the final leverage in place in each one of the projects. Well, we could think about that. And if it doesn't work, well, let's ask our governments to please pour a little bit of money, because they supported that. They said, this is our president, this is our plan. Yes, go ahead. Well, if it doesn't work, and if we've got to pour money into it, well, let's go to our governments and say, hello, it's not enough. But let's not just say no right at the beginning, because if we say no right at the beginning, what do we say afterwards? Guillermo? Well, no, steps are being taken, because please remember that the budget in the OECD was for farming. Let's keep the countryside alive. Now, since the money comes from VAT, you take money from the families that most consume, that's the poorer families, and that money goes to the common agricultural policy, which basically was funding the expenses of landowners. So that's pretty dramatic. Now that's changed, and now it's only 40% of the sum total of the budget in Europe. 40, yes, that's what I heard, but roughly 40. 38, okay. Well, you can do many, many more things with our European budget. And as you point out, it is of tremendous interest. And solid proof of that is that at this point in time, if we think about what Draghi has done, Spain, and this is a contradiction, this is contradictory. Spain is funding the markets less than what the US is funding right now. So we are cheaper than the States. So it's surrealistic, yes. So there's a lot of things that are unreal when we think about this situation. Why? Because there are huge amounts. You know, since the rates have been so very low, and because investment funds want to guarantee more profits to their stakeholders, what they do is they look around, and that's why they, in the past year, have come to Spain. You had 700 billion invested in Spain. Part went to loans, part was shares, part was direct investment. Why? Because there is a need to look for profits, no matter how. Yes, let me just share a footnote, another layer of surrealism. Okay, let's believe the Juncker plan, but it would be, I think, very useful if, apart from the Commission, it were backed with money by the member states, investments-wise. The anecdote. I don't know whether you travel in Germany in recent times, but for whatever reasons, until 3 years ago I didn't, and now I do. I travel a lot in Germany. Until 3 years ago, I thought that German railroads would be as punctual as the Swiss are. Well, no. They have a different punctuality. The German trains are always systematically late. Not a lot. Sometimes yes, but but always late. So you make the connection because you're 6 minutes late, but the connecting train is also 6 minutes late. And you ask, and there is investment in infrastructures in Germany because Germany doesn't invest in her own infrastructures. It's fine if they don't invest here, but why don't they invest at home? Because their infrastructures need those investments. I wonder about that. Well, thank you very much. We could talk for weeks and months, but it's time for a coffee. So coffee, yes, but at 12:33, we reconvene. Thank you.